You know those moments when a thought just sparks out of nowhere, like a sudden insight, maybe a feeling you can't quite put your finger on?
Uh-huh.
That's the kind of thing we're digging into today. We're taking a deep dive into what your source material calls the sixth sense.
Exactly. We're looking at chapter 14,
Yeah.
and it frames this sixth sense not as, not really as psychic stuff, but as a really critical principle within a larger way of thinking.
Okay.
What's really fascinating is that the author presents it as the absolute peak, the culmination of this whole philosophy.
The peak, huh? Sounds pretty important then. The chapter suggests that really understanding the sixth sense could actually, well, alert you to dangers and guide you toward opportunities.
That's the claim. It's presented as this, like, ultimate edge, a way to get a deeper handle on how success and achievement actually work.
Interesting. So where does the author place this sense? Is it physical, mental?
It's placed firmly within the realm of your subconscious mind, linked specifically to what they call the creative imagination.
Creative imagination. Okay.
Think of that as your internal space, where new ideas, inspirations, hunches, where they take shape.
Yeah.
Your mind's idea generator, maybe.
Right. And here's where it gets, well, pretty big. The source material hints that this sixth sense might even act as a connection between our own minds and something much larger.
Yeah, a universal mind, or infinite intelligence, as the author puts it. That's a pretty significant concept.
It really is. But there's a catch, isn't there?
There is a big one. That the author makes a really important point. You can't just jump in and, expect to flip a switch and use this sixth sense.
Ah.
The text strongly states that a genuine understanding and actually applying it only comes after you've truly grasped and integrated the 12 principles that come before it in the book.
Okay, so that's crucial context. While we're focusing just on this chapter, as requested, we have to remember that foundation the author emphasizes.
Absolutely.
Right, so let's try to unpack this ineffable sixth sense. The author is quite upfront that it defies description, at least for anyone who hasn't really absorbed those earlier principles.
Yeah, it sounds like it's something that needs to be experienced internally to truly get it.
Right, less intellectual, more experiential.
That seems to be the core idea.
Mhm.
The text emphasizes that this understanding develops through internal mind development, and specifically mentions meditation as a key practice for that.
Meditation.
It's presented as this blend, sort of our mental and spiritual sides, which circles back to that potential connection with a universal mind.
So what about those practical benefits? Because let's be honest, getting warnings about danger and notifications of opportunity, that sounds incredibly useful.
It does. It almost feels like the author is suggesting we can develop an internal guidance system.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
The author even uses a powerful image, the idea of a guardian angel that appears as you develop this sense.
A guardian angel.
Metaphorically, yeah.
Yeah.
One that opens the door to what they call the Temple of Wisdom. It's a strong metaphor for accessing this higher guidance stream.
But the author's also quick to say this isn't about miracles in the usual sense, right? They don't believe in, like, supernatural stuff.
Exactly. They explicitly state they don't believe in traditional miracles and see the sixth sense as operating within the natural laws of the universe, even if we don't currently understand all the mechanics behind it.
Okay, so grounded in nature, but maybe a part of nature we don't fully grasp yet.
That's the angle. The text grounds it in the concept of a pervasive infinite intelligence that governs everything around us, from the smallest atom to the biggest galaxy.
Right.
And the author believes that by understanding and applying these philosophical principles, we can essentially induce this intelligence to help us achieve our desires. They even share their own personal experiences as sort of proof of this.
And again, it keeps looping back to needing mastery of the earlier steps first.
Mm.
The author really hammers this point home, doesn't he?
He really does. That foundation is crucial for truly understanding the claims made in this specific chapter. It creates this interesting dynamic where the most powerful principle is sort of gated,
Yeah, gated by your engagement with the foundational ideas. Makes sense.
Exactly.
Now, the chapter takes a really personal and kind of unexpected turn with the author's deep dive into hero worship and this practice of the invisible counselors. I wasn't expecting that.
No, it's a very revealing part of the chapter, quite illustrative. The author explained how this childhood habit of looking up to and emulating people they admired carried into adulthood.
Okay.
They found that the strong belief they attached to this imitation really amplified their ability to adopt the qualities they admired in others.
And this then grew into creating these invisible counselors, these nightly imaginary meetings with 9 specific historical figures Who were they and what was the goal?
Right. The 9 were Emerson, Paine, Edison, Darwin, Lincoln, Burbank, Napoleon, Ford, and Carnegie. A
Yeah.
real powerhouse group. And the author's goal was very deliberate, to consciously rebuild their own character by absorbing the traits they admired in each of these individuals. They basically made themselves the chair of this imagined advisory board.
And the main tool for this was autosuggestion, deliberately directing thoughts and desires.
That's it. Autosuggestion is like consciously planting thought seeds in your mind through repetition and focus.
Got it.
And the author, being familiar with psychological principles, understood how dominant thoughts really shape our personality and actions. So these nightly meetings were a focused exercise in that, a way to impress the subconscious mind.
So how did these meetings work? What specific qualities was the author trying to get from each figure?
They would address each counselor directly, often out loud, stating the specific qualities they wanted to build. From Emerson, it was understanding nature. Burbank, harmonizing with nature's laws.
Okay.
Napoleon was for inspiring leadership and enduring faith. Paine for freedom of thought, courage, clear expression. Darwin for patience, unbiased study of cause and effect.
Wow, very specific.
Very. Lincoln for justice, patience, humor, understanding, tolerance. Carnegie for understanding organized effort. Ford for persistence, determination, poise, self-confidence. And Edison, who the author apparently felt closest to in these sessions, for faith and relentless hard work.
That's quite a list of traits. And the author mentions changing how they addressed them based on what they were focusing on at the time.
Yeah, that really highlights how deliberate and focused this practice was. It wasn't just, idle daydreaming. It was active engagement.
Right.
And what's really wild is that these imagined figures apparently started to develop their own distinct personalities and even interacted with each other in the author's mind.
The chapter gives some vivid examples of that, doesn't it? Lincoln being late and kind of serious.
Yeah, and Burbank and Paine having witty banter, Napoleon getting upset when Paine suggested something about a church lecture.
It sounds like they almost became real to the author.
They really seem to. Those anecdotes make the whole practice feel much more tangible. Lincoln's advice about courage and trusting common people, or Edison's vision of life as energy swarms drawn by thought.
That Edison part was fascinating.
It really was. And what's maybe even more striking is that Edison, while he was still living, apparently validated the author's experience, calling the dream more a reality than you may imagine.
That's quite an endorsement. A bit mysterious, maybe, but powerful.
Definitely.
But the author also admits they got a bit scared by it all. Like the lines were blurring between imagination and reality, so they stopped for a while.
Yes, which I think highlights how intense this experience became and the author's own awareness of how powerful, how real our imagination can feel.
But the break didn't last long, did it?
No, relatively short-lived because of that very vivid experience, maybe a dream or vision of Lincoln.
Right, Lincoln urging them to keep going with their work, saying the world needed their philosophy.
Exactly. That experience, whatever its nature, had a huge impact and pushed the author to restart the meetings. They even expanded the council, didn't they, to over 50 figures eventually.
It's 50, wow. Okay, so how does this all connect back to the sixth sense itself?
Ah, the crucial link. The author suggests their mind became most receptive to inspired ideas, to knowledge flowing in during these imagined meetings.
So the counselors were like a conduit.
That seems to be the idea. They explicitly credit these imaginary figures for many ideas and insights, attributing them to what felt like inspiration or intuition, basically, the sixth sense in action.
And the author even shares personal stories, right, about being miraculously guided in emergencies because of the influence of this council.
Yes, attributing that guidance directly back to this practice and the connection it fostered.
So, okay, this invisible counselors thing sounds maybe a bit out there to some people, but clearly the author found it a powerful way to tap into this sixth sense. But does the chapter say it's only useful for, like, massive ambition, getting rich?
Well, the author does state it's particularly valuable for individuals aiming for great wealth or achievement. But they also imply its benefits can extend to those with, let's say, more modest desires, too.
Okay.
The examples of Henry Ford and Thomas Edison are used, right? People who achieved immense success and innovation, suggesting they practically applied this principle. Edison inventing things outside his expertise is a key example given.
And the author brings up other historical figures, too. Napoleon, Joan of Arc, religious leaders, suggesting this sense was part of their greatness.
That's right. It positions this sixth sense as a potential common thread in exceptional success across many different fields and eras.
So how does someone actually develop this sense? Can you just, like, decide to turn it on?
Ah, no. The chapter explains it's a gradual process. It unfolds through consistent, dedicated application of the other principles, the ones that come earlier in the book.
Back to the prerequisites again.
Exactly. And interestingly, the author notes that a working knowledge of the sixth sense typically doesn't really show up until later in life, often after 40, maybe even 50.
Why so late?
They attribute this to maturity, the idea that it takes time for our spiritual forces, as they put it, to mature through things like meditation, self-examination, deep thinking. It's not presented as a quick fix.
Right, makes sense. It's earned, not just learned overnight.
Precisely. It requires sustained effort, looking inward and really engaging with the whole philosophical framework.
But even if someone reads this and thinks, okay, this sixth sense thing feels a bit abstract, maybe I don't fully get it yet, the author reassures them there's still value in the rest of the philosophy, right?
Absolutely. The inclusion of this chapter is presented as the capstone, the final piece of a comprehensive philosophy for achieving desires. But the ultimate goal, according to the text, isn't just stuff. It's deeper understanding
Understanding of what?
of ourselves, of other people, of nature, of what actually brings happiness.
And that deeper understanding, the author suggests, comes most fully through the sixth sense, making it essential for those seeking more than just, say, money.
That's exactly how it's positioned,
Yeah.
as the key that unlocks a more profound level of wisdom and insight, going beyond just material success.
Okay. The chapter wraps up with a kind of interesting suggestion. To reread this chapter again and again over time without stressing about understanding it all immediately. Why?
The idea seems to be that repeated exposure allows the concepts to seep in. It can gradually unlock a latent power within us
A power to do what?
to help overcome negativity, master fears, tap into imagination, and ultimately transmute desires into their physical equivalent. It's about letting it sink into the subconscious over time, almost like osmosis,
Letting the ideas work on you, maybe?
something like that. And this then leads directly into the next chapter's topic, which is mastering fear, building right on the previous discussions about faith.
Right, a logical next step.
Yes, the author sets the stage by introducing what they call the 6 ghosts of fear. Things like discouragement, procrastination, blaming them as the root causes of negative states.
And emphasizing that these fears are often subconscious.
Yes, and warning that even though they are ghosts just in the mind, they can be incredibly damaging because of the power of uncontrolled imagination.
They use the Great Depression as an example, don't they? The fear of poverty.
Exactly. A stark, real-world example of how destructive that particular ghost, the fear of poverty, could be on a massive scale.
Okay, so let's just sum this up. In this deep dive into the chapter on the sixth sense, we've looked at the author's claim that it's the absolute pinnacle of their philosophy.
Right, acting as a bridge to the subconscious mind, the creative imagination, and potentially to that universal intelligence, offering guidance, warnings, and opportunities.
We've also hit hard on that critical prerequisite, mastering the 12 principles that come before it. And we explored the author's very personal, maybe unique practice of the invisible counselors.
Yeah, as a method they use for character building and, crucially, for accessing inspiration, which they linked directly to this sixth sense.
We also touched on its practical uses, mentioning figures like Ford and Edison, and the idea that while it's maybe key for huge success, it has benefits beyond just wealth.
And that developing it is a gradual journey tied to maturity, introspection, leading ultimately to a deeper understanding of life, not just material gain.
And we noted the author's advice to revisit this chapter over time, letting it sink in before moving on to tackle the ghosts of fear. So yeah, I think this deep dive has really aimed to cover all the main ideas, the stories, the insights, and examples the author presented in this specific chapter on the sixth sense.
Agreed. We've definitely walked through the core content presented there.
So for you, the listener, maybe take a moment to think about those flashes of intuition you might have had, those sudden ideas. Even if invisible counselors feels a bit strange, could that underlying idea, intentionally focusing your mind to cultivate traits you admire, hold something for you? And given the author's constant stress on mastering the basics first, what aspects of your own mindset or habits might be the foundation needed to maybe, just maybe, start developing this sixth sense in your own way? This deep dive has indeed covered all the key concepts, the narratives, the examples from this chapter on the sixth sense. We made sure not to skip any sections or leave out any important details.